Out of the original 3 Resident Evil games, Nemesis was the one that I always liked the least. It's not that it was a bad game, it's just that Resident Evil 2 was the first game I played in the series, and one that I have a bit of a personal attachment to. Still, that shouldn't really stop me from enjoying the Resident Evil 3 remake, but my problems with this one stem more from the game itself, rather than my own personal preferences for the series. This remake's been in development pretty much since the remake of Resident Evil 2, however it wasn't developed by the main team at Capcom, and it really does feel like it. If this is your first time playing Resident Evil 3 and you never played the original, well then you might find this a really enjoyable game and not even have any issues. People who've played the original though, which is I'm assuming going to be the biggest demographic, will I think be upset by the amount of changes that this remake makes. None of them really ever for the greater good, and removing a lot of the elements that made the old game so enjoyable.
Sorry about that. Everyone's a little worked up.
As a pretty big fan of the old games, the best word I'd use to sum this whole thing up is disappointing. It's not a bad game per se, but I just don't think it's a good remake. And I'm going to do my best to explain why I think that is.
Good luck. Let's go.
Okay, so quick recap on the story. Resident Evil 3 takes place around the same time as the second game, when rookie cop Leon Kennedy and poor Claire Redfield are having the worst days of their life. And in another part of Raccoon City, Jill Valentine is also trying to make a move and escape the now infected and dangerous streets. Her goal is still mostly the same as the original. She'll team up with the Umbrella Corp's biohazard countermeasure team with returning champion Carlos, who again serves as a second playable character, while also being hunted down by Nemesis, who's kinda like an upgraded model of the Tyrant from Resident Evil 2. I mean, if Mr. X is DVD, well, Nemesis is Blu-ray. Like they did in the second game, most of the core ideas of the story have still been kept intact, just with a bigger focus on the cinematics and the dialogue. Instead of watching people just stand around and talk to each other now, you get fully scripted cutscenes. Often with a fair bit of profanity too, and I have to admit that hearing Jill drop an F-bomb is pretty cute.
What the fuck was that?
Now, I'm one of the few people who also doesn't have an issue with the new Jill redesign. I know a lot of people complained about this before the game's release, but look, honestly, she does a pretty good job with what she's given.
Okay.
I mean, I do think the whole jeans and singlet tough girl look is getting pretty old, but it fits with the setting itself, and she gets suitably beat up and dirty as the game progresses. And I don't know what the hell people are talking about saying she doesn't look feminine. I mean, she looks cute as fuck. These games have pretty much passed into Uncanny Valley at this stage, with hyper-realistic facial animations and lip syncing. You can see the smears of dirt and blood on Jill's face and the individual hairs on Carlos's beard. The environments are highly detailed, and some of the lighting effects from things like neon signs looks really eye-catching. The zombies are about on par with what we got in the last game, which is mostly just because they've reused a lot of the same models and animations. You can expect to see a few odd glitches here and there though. Then you've got this animation. Jill showing absolutely no concern for the fact that a giant mutated bug has wrapped its mandibles around her neck. I mean, what's supposed to be going through her mind here? Please, someone tell me.
Okay.
But at least in terms of upping the ante and making the city look like an epidemic battleground, they've definitely done a good job of that.
In here!
The real showstopper though is Nemesis, who's way more detailed than his PlayStation 1 counterpart. That version I think was comprised of about as many polygons as you can count on 2 hands. Now he looks like a goddamn force of nature. He's covered in basically biohazard material at the beginning of the game. And as you get into combat with him, his exterior slowly whittles away and he transforms into more monstrous visages. And I mean, that's really the whole point of the game, isn't it?
Silly bitch, yo, what the fuck out here?
But if this is a remake, then it is to Resident Evil 3 what Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes was to Metal Gear Solid. And if that analogy makes sense, well, you can probably just stop watching right now. My point is that this game is often about as subtle as a bulldozer in an antique store, and what a perfect analogy. The game hasn't even been going for 5 minutes before Nemesis bursts through your apartment wall like the goddamn Kool-Aid Man. Then you spend the next few minutes in an incredibly scripted sequence of hopelessly outrunning him. Yeah, get used to these kind of sequences because most of the time you come up against this guy, this is what you're going to be dealing with. Somehow, despite Nemesis being so much more detailed and animated, and able to do all of this new stuff when it comes to attacking you, he's somehow far less intimidating and threatening. And I think that's because a lot of the time the player is attacked by him, things are more or less out of your control. The only bit to me where it felt close like the original game is when you're still in downtown Raccoon City. At a certain point in the campaign, Nemesis keeps popping up randomly and pursuing you, and you can either fight him or run away, though you pretty much have to fight him. After doing enough damage, he'll shut down for a short period of time, dropping a crate with an important item like a pistol upgrade or extra ammo. And these I think are the best moments in the game because they remind me the most of the original, not to mention they're pretty harrowing. When you see him come sprinting around a corner at you, haymaker at the ready. This is when it feels the most like a Resident Evil game, moving through the narrow streets, avoiding zombies and collecting what few key items you have to find. After you leave this initial area though, it just kinda goes off the rails. From this point on, pretty much every time he attacks you now, it's so blatantly obvious that something is going to happen. A lot of the time you're unable to even fight back, or even in control, you just progress through some kind of scripted sequence for a bit until the game finally lets you attack him. Like this bit here where you've got to climb up this construction building while he's chasing you down with a flamethrower. Kinda makes Jill's movement speed seem even more bizarre. I mean, she's doing what could be described as a light jog when a 7-foot-tall biohazard weapon is chasing after her with a goddamn flamethrower. Imagine how much better this could have been if all of his appearances were totally randomized, you know what I mean? Like you could play the campaign each time and never know where or when he was going to appear. Like the Xenomorph in Alien Isolation for instance, or shit, even Mr. X in the Resident Evil 2 remake was way more unpredictable than this.
Okay.
Kind of removes that entire fear and shock element for the antagonist if you know when and where it's going to attack you every single time. And I think that's my single biggest problem with this remake, that and the pacing of the campaign. On that note, can we please just talk about Carlos? Now look, I like the guy as much as anybody else. In fact, he's probably one of my second favourite side characters apart from Lewis in Resident Evil 4. But I just think they focus on this guy way too much. That whole section from the original game when Jill goes back to the police department to get her stuff, now Carlos is playable during that whole segment instead. And of course it's just the same levels from the second game reused. I'd say it's probably a 60-40 ratio to the amount of time you spend playing as Jill to the amount of time you spend playing as Carlos, even further making the game feel less and less like the original. One of the sections in the hospital, you've got to hold out in the lobby, shooting zombies as they pour through the nearby windows, standing off nearby generators to zap and stun them, along with killing a few hunters as well. And this goes on for like 5 or so minutes and you're just flushed with ammo the entire time. Just doesn't even feel like Resident Evil 3 at this point, it's just like some kind of generic zombie shooter. And yes, I know that the Carlos sections in the original game were more action-packed due to him having an assault rifle, but did we really need this? The other changes though, I think are even more egregious. Like they've just completely removed huge sections of the game entirely. The whole boss fight against Gravedigger for instance is completely gone. The areas in the clock tower and the factory also got the chop. Crows and spiders are absent from the game too. I don't know what these remakes have against the spiders. Now they're replaced with these giant fleas infected by the T-virus that now plant eggs inside your stomach, through the means that you just know is making someone somewhere rock hard. Harking back again to that cinematic I was talking about earlier, where Jill pulls a facial expression that can only really be described as restrained arousal.
What the fuck?
The outcome of certain key characters has now also been massively changed, and all I can ask is, why? Oh, and you can forget Mercenaries Mode 2, that's completely gone, replaced by the standalone game called Resident Evil Resistance that no one asked for. A lot of the earlier puzzles from the beginning of the game when Jill is moving through the city have just been completely removed or simplified. The fountain puzzle is gone along with the infamous clock tower puzzle. In fact, I even struggle to call these new additions puzzles in the first place. All you're really doing now is just running around and interacting with an object. Like early on, you've got to go through this nest and flip on a bunch of power transformers. Later on, you have to find a bunch of fuses in a dimly lit warehouse and you just run around and pick them up. There's barely any time you need to seriously worry about inventory management or any of that stuff either, because important items are often used quickly after you've acquired them. And yeah, remember when you actually picked up an item and had no idea what the hell you were supposed to do with it? You'd have to explore the environment naturally and discover its purpose. Well, now you know exactly what you're supposed to do for each and every item now. It's kind of like Resident Evil puzzles for babies. About the only improvement I think is that you no longer need to lug around that reloading tool to make ammo. You can now instantly combine gunpowder or explosive types in your inventory. The Resident Evil 2 remake I always thought did a good balance of keeping the gameplay from the original but also making things feel a bit more modernized. like removing the tank controls from the original and being able to move around at the same time as aiming down your sights. Made the shooting way more enjoyable because you weren't just planted in one spot like a sitting duck. And yet, nothing's really been done to improve on this, at least in terms of the base shooting. In fact, in a lot of ways it's been downgraded, beginning with the gore system, which is a lot less detailed. Shooting enemies still feels very unsatisfying. The weapon sounds for the pistol and the shotgun are just really underwhelming. It just doesn't have the kind of oomph you're looking for unless you're lucky enough to score a critical hit, in which case a zombie's head completely explodes, leaving behind meaty chunks. The grenade launcher makes a return, though this time you've only got explosive, acid, and flame rounds, no ice grenades. Just another thing they've removed for no good reason. You do also get mine grenades, which I guess is the closest we're going to get to the mine thrower, but I found I only ever needed to use these for a specific boss fight. After that, there's not all that much ammo for it. And it also irks me how Jill can be seen reloading 6 full grenades back into the weapon, even if you're not reloading that many grenades. Now that's just lazy animation. What I do like though is how you can now perform an actual dodge move, and unlike the original in which it was usually really tricky to pull off, now it's instead mapped to spacebar on the keyboard and you'll use this a whole heap, at least you should be. When you pull off a perfect dodge, you're given a brief moment of slowed down time to line up a shot, and this mechanic is really useful during the many fights against Nemesis to the point that it makes these boss fights kind of easy. Oddly too, they've removed the sub-weapons in this remake too, so there's no knife or flash grenade to get yourself out of something grabbing onto you, which is just a complete step backwards. I don't know why they would have done this. I mean, these have been in the remake since they remade the first game. It's just odd. It's odd. Honestly though, I've always found the shooting in these games to take second fiddle to the puzzle solving and the exploration aspect of the games, and this is still the case with this one. Having to pump half a dozen shotgun shells into something at point blank range to kill it just isn't all that fun. It just feels like antiquated design, and it's a shame that the series hasn't found a way to progress past this. But the only thing I genuinely liked was the end fight against Nemesis, which was just so over the top that I couldn't help but enjoy it, even if it did just completely conflict with the whole dark and gritty atmosphere they'd been trying to set for the rest of the game. Off the back of that, it is worth mentioning that this is pretty short, even for a Resident Evil game. I finished it on my first playthrough in about 4 hours, and that was with going around and trying to get absolutely everything I could find. Then the second time I replayed it, it was a little bit over 2 hours. To be honest though, length isn't really an issue when it comes to these games, and they've never been super long. I think when I first played the original on the PlayStation 1, it wouldn't have taken me more than 10 or so hours to get through. I don't agree with the sentiment that this should have been DLC, because I think if you're still a fan of the series, the replay factor is still really high. You gotta try to attain that coveted S+ rank, not to mention unlocking all of the weapons and cosmetics. Still though, with the removal of the mercenaries mode, which I still can't wrap my head around, it's really gonna hurt the longevity this might have had. And I think we're gonna be seeing some really fast speedrun times here when people start getting deep into this thing and seeing how they can break it.
Alright. I'm in.
For me though, this remake just feels like a step backwards for the series. It's full of scripted sequences, cinematics, and over-the-top set pieces that feel more like something we should have got in Resident Evil 5 or 6. It doesn't really add anything new or improve on the mechanics from the last remake, and in a lot of ways, especially with the shooting, like I said, it feels like a step backwards. The puzzles are so basic that they may as well not exist, and the hallmarks of the series, including inventory management and the rationing of resources, is all but absent. So yes, you can enter the world of survival horror once again, but is that really a trip you want to make?
What the fuck?